Welcome everyone to the AU podcast series, where we hear about the work, amazing work that some of the amazing people we have on the continent are doing towards the Africa we want. Today, we've got a special guest with us. I'm going to let her introduce herself and tell us a little bit about the work that she does. So, Michelle, if you could introduce yourself and tell us about the work that you do.
Thank you so much, Ademola, and a real pleasure to be here. Thanks to the African Union for hosting this. My name is Michelle Chivunga. I run a fintech company called the Global Policy House. And the Global Policy House really focused around looking at digitization and emerging technologies around the world, with a focus on emerging markets, especially Africa. I myself am from Zambia, but have been working round the clock, really, especially since COVID hit, to look at how digitization and the digital transformation journey can help economies, within sort of the recovery as well. I also work quite closely with a lot of young people to train and educate around emerging technology. So this includes things like blockchain, AI, cybersecurity, and really trying to help build capacity and understanding around how these technologies can be utilized and leveraged. We work quite closely with governments as well around the world. I advise several governments, including the government of Bermuda in the Caribbean, and other parts of the world, where again, there we've been looking more around digitization and how we can build the ecosystem, in terms of the digital ecosystem, as well as trying to help entrepreneurs and small businesses to leverage technology.
That's quite a lot, and we're excited to have you here speak to us. The conversation today will focus a lot around financial inclusion and using technology to drive financial inclusion for young people across the African continent. So we're glad to have you here. So Michelle, tell us a little bit about your thoughts around the increase in interest in the financial inclusion topic. Everybody speaks about it. Is it really a problem for young people in Africa, and how deep is the problem?
Yes, no, absolutely. I think financial inclusion is a big challenge across the continent, especially when you're, referring to young people and also women. Africa, as everybody knows, 60-70% of Africa is SMEs and entrepreneur-led. And in terms of the businesses and entrepreneurs accessing finance, it's a real challenge, and still remains a challenge today. So the problem is widespread. It's not a case of, it's just a problem in one country, but I mean, the sort of depth of the problem is very different when you move from country to country. So in terms of, financial inclusion, very important. We have quite a lot of people who are not necessarily within the financial ecosystem as well, which again is a problem. So a lot of people who are not banked or don't have access to bank accounts, so they don't have that financial capital, which is very important for just as an individual, as well as whether you're in business or you're an entrepreneur or young person, you need to have that financial capital. So it's a big problem, and I think financial inclusion is being looked at by everybody, because I think the financial capacity really plays a big role in helping to develop and sustain people individually, but also economies as a whole. That's why you will see that I think a lot of governments and even central banks are leaning more towards not just creating financial stability in economies, but really ensuring that we have some financial inclusion, especially for at the lower end. We have a lot of big informal settings around Africa. And I think those informal settings, really struggle, especially when it comes to access to finance. And that's something that we need to address moving forward.
Yeah. And that's interesting. You speak about the various stakeholders that sort of need to be part of this conversation. One key argument that often comes up is, if you ask what the reason why a lot of people are excluded, you probably hear things around costs of doing this. How can we drive the cost down? I feel like this discussion is much more than the policy discussion, especially if there are significant costs involved with it. Would it make sense to drive this, considering the fact that a lot of the people who are not included are poor and can't afford it? Yes.
Yes, absolutely. And I think there's a lot of people who are not included at all. Like I said, they don't have the financial capital, which always which kind of exacerbated, makes it worse when it comes to things like the poverty gap. We keep, increasing the poverty gap because we're not addressing the challenges at the lower end. So I think one of the things that really needs to be looked at, apart from just the policy angle, is actually practical solutions around enabling finance to reach people who are at the lower end. So even in countries now are starting to think about things like really new innovative ways of delivering access to financial capital, financial inclusion, and that can include things like central bank digital currencies, which is very early concept that's being explored at the moment around the world. This is kind of the idea of how we can use, central bank currency to actually try and almost decentralize access for people to be able to access financial capital. But we do need practical measures. So even now, we're obviously in the COVID times, how are people who are located in rural areas being able to access finance that they need? It can be very difficult. There isn't a case of bank branches that are close to them, for example, which it makes very hard for people to get access to the cash that they need. Are we moving away from a world where we are operating with cash, and what does that actually mean in terms of financial inclusion? And how ready are people for that change? Do we actually need that change on the continent? So it's these kind of discussions I think need to be had, but we also have to create some very practical measures in place to address, specifically for us in the continent and how we're structured in the continent. So for us in the continent, I think a lot of people still do rely quite, especially the informal sector, still do rely quite heavily around cash and having cash to actually do business. Small
Yeah.
scale businesses need that liquidity to flow. And currently it can be very difficult. So you find that a lot of the measures that are being introduced by several, banks and stakeholders are really geared towards the small, medium enterprises, because that's where there's a lot of flow of trade, for example, and we need to build that up a lot more and find practical ways of making sure that people can access the liquidity and then bring them back into the system. And then there's of course technologies that can help with that.
Yeah. It's interesting that you end with that point, because that's I was going to ask you to give us a little bit some examples. It's still early days. This topic has been an interesting topic that sort of we've spoken about it for a few years, 5 to 10 years. Give us a few examples of some of the things that you've seen that you think early wins, early successes around the inclusion, whether it's around just access to banking, or interestingly, if you can even speak to some of the examples that you see around other financial services, say loans and credit ratings and all of those kind of things.
Yes. So one very interesting one that I have been involved in is I've noticed quite a lot in African economies where women entrepreneurs, for example, come together as cooperatives and form their own cooperatives where they are, collecting sums of money and they're lending each other sums of money to be able to do their business. That, for example, is innovation in itself. Now you can take that and digitize that, to kind of decentralize that offering, right? By using technologies like blockchain. And we're starting to see this happening. So across Africa, we've got very young, talented people. I think 50% of the population in Africa is under the age of 25. Are we kind of leveraging those young people and the ideas that they have and their creativity? So to build new innovations, using things like the mobile, to be able to decentralize access to loans or microloans, very important. How do we do that to ensure that we reach those women or those entrepreneurs that they can tap on that financing simply by just using their mobile? They don't necessarily have to understand that, okay, this is either blockchain based offering, right? But they can use their mobile to access the financing, or for them to be able to get the microloans that they're looking for. So almost kind of the same concept of that cooperative I mentioned, where they're starting to decentralize by giving loans to each other. Now that whole experience can be digitized, and we're starting to see that happen across Africa. You're starting to see a lot of young African companies, scaling up. We've had Paystack the other time, who are doing really well and growing and expanding. So I think the environment is right, but we do need to offer a lot more support, especially around the access to finance. That's one of the biggest challenges. Every time I've spoken to entrepreneurs in Africa, ourselves included, we've had to kind of been really, really struggle to access finance. So I think building on decentralized offerings, or what we're calling like blockchain-based finance or digital financing, that can really start to unravel, and provide more opportunity for these entrepreneurs. So we're starting to see a little bit of that. I think more work needs to be done to look at, raising awareness about some of the schemes and new innovations that are coming onto the table. Then big one is more around, providing the education on how you can actually leverage this, especially at the informal level. So working with the women who are trading, working with the entrepreneurs who are trading, and starting to offer them a more holistic business support package, and that will help them in terms of, understanding, okay, this is how I can do business in what market, who am I operating with, can I use my mobile to access those digital financial services I talked about, right? And if I can access that, then I can get my 1,000 naira, or my naira, or I can get my currency in order for me to scale what I'm doing. Very, very important, because if without scale, I think we are continuing to face some challenges around growing what we are seeing on the ground, and we're seeing quite a lot of innovation starting to grow, but we do need to scale that.
Okay. So quick one, you're already speaking to a few recommendations. So I'm just going to ask you very quick questions. What's your recommendation to policymakers? What's your recommendation to young people? And what's your recommendation to, we call them sometimes dinosaurs in the space around finance, to the banks, the traditional banks, and all of those things.
Yes, no, thank you so much. I mean, it's very, very exciting. I think for me, I'm really, really excited with what's happening on the continent. So number one, I want to applaud the young people, because young people are really coming up with the innovations that we haven't heard about. And a lot of them actually don't have the visibility, so they're busy doing what they're doing and creating stuff and making stuff, especially on the innovation and the digital side. The young people I have met blow my mind away because of what they're doing, because they're doing it with very little support in terms of, access to finance, right? So for me, I really, really applaud the young people. I encourage you to really carry on what you're doing, but at the same time, don't fear to venture out to learn from what everybody else is doing. So start creating those networks. We call what we have a saying, networks of networks create opportunity. So start creating and building communities of networks where you're learning from each other and you're starting to build. And that will also help you build, knowledge capital. The other thing I want to emphasize for young people is also venture into other areas. So it's not just about sexy technology. It's about how do you go and build agribusiness, for example. It's also quite sexy to be in agriculture, to be in manufacturing, and come up, with solutions which are needed for Africa. As we know, we're trying to look at industrialization across the continent. So it's very important that we don't get too caught up with just being in the digital space, for example. The digital space is almost kind of enabling. So you can take that and utilize the digital stuff around agriculture, around manufacturing. All that stuff is very, very exciting. So keep going. And I think young people need more of a voice, need more of a platform, so that they can actually raise their concerns. And there are quite a few concerns. And it'd be good to have, maybe like even young ambassadors who can go and raise concerns about what's going on. On the policy recommendations, I really want to try and to policymakers to say, look, we really, really appreciate if the policymakers can create that enabling environment, especially around innovation. So there's still a number of questions on regulation, on things like, data regulation, a number of questions on things like the fintech ecosystem, and trying to find proper regulation around things like cryptocurrencies and things like that. We can't ignore these things because they are going to be there. And then also, I think on the policymakers, I would recommend an Africa-wide education platform where we can start to build capacity around the emerging technology. For example, even with policymakers, we start to train on things like trade facilitation and enabling trade to happen a bit more seamlessly by tapping on technology and other things that I talked about. So very much creating the right environment, supporting initiatives that provide access to finance is very important even for policymakers. And then working in collaboration, so from department to department across governments, we tend to work kind of in silos. very important we start to collaborate a lot more. I think we'll achieve more scale there. To the banking community and the commercial banks and others, I think, commercial banks really need to think about innovating, and innovating very big, but also working with innovators, so that the fintechs and creating what we call kind of sandbox communities where they're operating together to come up with solutions that are actually needed for the market. It's no longer the case, going to a bank is very difficult to go to a bank if you're a small business like ourselves or an entrepreneur, because the bank isn't really, structured that way to offer you the services you need. And I think banks need to adjust and maybe adapt, a slight different offering, especially when it comes to SME. I said earlier on, Africa is full of SMEs. I think if the banks themselves cannot service that market, it makes it very, very difficult to grow the market. So I think banks need to be a little bit more flexible and maybe to adjust their offerings, working with fintechs and other groups as well. And then banks need to think about the future of money. Future of money is going to be very, very different, especially when we start to see in the world, things like central bank digital currencies, like I said earlier on. What is the role of banks in that? I still think banks will have a massive, massive role to play, even with the existence of things like central bank digital currencies, because they can innovate and they can start to offer other offerings that they're not doing at the moment, which are much, much needed in the market, especially in building that financial inclusion that we talked about.
Thanks a lot, Michelle. Thanks for this. Actually, I think one of the things that have struck me about all your recommendations is the fact that there seems to be a heavy emphasis around community. So for young people, despite all of the successes, in spite of the hardship that they have to had realities that they have to do this in, might be benefit from building a community of learning, of solutions. Policymakers might benefit from having some sort of community for support, for collaboration. That might even help them think around regulation, thinking around how to build regulatory sandboxes and all those kind of things around financing. And then you speak to that as well when you're speaking about commercial banks, having to create a community that understands, the challenges of SMEs and I will be able to respond to those challenges. I think that's great. And I think that, we're almost out of time, but it would be interesting to have, if we had time, we probably would have gone through each of these recommendations in details. Final point, Michelle, before we leave. So this is a quick fire round. We always end our podcast with a quick fire round, which I'm going to ask you one or two questions and you respond with one sentence or a phrase if you can, actually. So how would you explain what you do to a 5-year-old?
Yes, so what we do is help to build knowledge, is help to learn you, make you understand how the world operates, how you can actually access money to create your world, and also making sure that everybody has access to opportunities and goals, and everybody's included in the world.
Thank you. What's the most rewarding part of your job?
Most rewarding part is actually inspiring other young people and making sure that they have access to knowledge and opportunity to create their own wealth. For me, that's very, very inspiring.
That's great to hear. And thank you for being inspirational. You've actually inspired us in our own space as well. Thanks a lot, Michelle, for joining us today. We hope that we can continue to look for opportunities to build that community that we spoke about during the podcast.